Hello, this is Christian Perring, and here I am to give some words to these slides on the morality of abortion and infanticide. There's like about 32 slides, and it's possible I may add to it later on, but this is what we got right now, and so let's start. So the traditional debate about abortion it revolves around whether or not the fetus is a person, whether it has value, and if it has value, then the common assumption is then abortion is wrong, or at least problematic. So we might make a contrast with other things in the body. Some people have made comparisons with haircuts. But a different sort of one would be comparing abortion to having a tumor removed. We don't think a tumor has any value, so there's no debate about removing it. The idea is it's totally the decision of the person who is carrying the tumor. But we don't think that it's quite the same thing as having an abortion. There is a kind of debate on there is the other side that we definitely think it's wrong to be killing young children, like a 5-year-old, and therefore we think that if we think that a fetus has the same value as a 5-year-old, then it would definitely be wrong to kill a fetus. We might kind of I think it's a pretty safe assumption for most cultures that killing a 5-year-old is wrong, although possibly there are some patriarchal cultures in which we'd have to restrict that to a 5-year-old male. So if we're trying to work out what to think about abortion, then at least on this sort of view, the issue is, to what extent is a fetus something with a value? Does it have like the value of a 5-year-old? Does it have no value at all? Is it just a clump of cells? So that's the way the debate goes. So if we're going to think about value, then there's issues about what gives an entity something like an organism, what gives it value. And we might consider experience, or the utilitarian view is that it's the capacity to experience pain and pleasure. The Kantian view is that it's to do with rationality, and also similarly for the Aristotelian view, it's all about rationality. So we might ask then, when does a fetus get to have experiences? When does it have pleasure and pain? When it can have sensations? And when can a fetus, if ever, have any rationality? Maybe we might think rationality only starts later on in life, when you're kind of 1-year-old, 2 years old. There's also other capacities we might want to consider apart from experience and rationality. One obvious one would be the capacity to love. So, when does a fetus ever have the capacity to love, to recognize another being? Maybe not. It's hard to know. But it seems less likely that it does, right? So I'm going to assume, for the sake of this presentation, that you already know what utilitarianism is, and so I'm just going to move you straight into talking about how it relates to the issue of abortion. As far as I know, all the kind of the philosophical utilitarians who have addressed the issue, at least in uh, the last several decades, have defended a woman's right to abortion. I'm certainly ready to be corrected on that one. But uh, it seems basically, the assumption is that if you do the utilitarian calculation, then a woman should have the legal right to an abortion. And that sort of fits in historically with utilitarianism's kind of basically liberal stance. Uh, Defending the right to an abortion is a liberal stance. Utilitarianism tends to go with liberalism. Therefore, utilitarianism should defend the right to an abortion. Uh, Now, I think actually it's quite complicated and not at all obvious that utilitarianism should, in fact, defend the right to an abortion on their theory. It makes a big difference what version of utilitarianism is being discussed. Kind of, I always find it odd that the kind of the main textbooks always make this big deal between rule utilitarianism and act utilitarianism. Certainly, there is that distinction to be made, but it's not. It's just not that interesting. But the question about whether or not a utilitarian is trying to promote the average happiness of society or trying to promote the total happiness of society makes quite a big difference. If it's the average, then you're looking at the average happiness per person. Pleasure minus pain is happiness. Obviously, all these calculations are very crude, at least, and may not even make a lot of sense. But the utilitarian assumption is that you can do the calculation. So it makes a big difference how many people are in the society. If you're looking at the average, and if you're looking at the total, then if you're adding new people, then and those people are happy, then you are increasing the total number or the total amount of happiness. I mean, it basically seems that if you are defending the total happiness version of utilitarianism, then each person has an obligation to try and increase the total population, at least until we are creating people who have basically no happiness. There is like the amount of pain in their lives is equal to the amount of pleasure in their lives. So if you're defending the total happiness version of utilitarianism, then it's going to be important to promote new life, and therefore it's going to be pretty hard to defend abortion. If, on the other hand, you're talking about the average happiness per person, and if having a baby will make the woman less happy, and if the baby's life is also not that happy because the mother didn't want it, then you can make a good argument that on the utilitarian view, the average happiness would go down if she had an abortion. So women should have the right to have abortions. Now, there's, so we have talked about that difference between the two different versions of utilitarianism. But there's also the question about what do we actually know about the effects of abortion laws on society. And those things are pretty hard to really kind of get the good information about. I guess I'm struck somewhat by the kind of parallel case about the death penalty and whether having the death penalty decreases or increases the amount of murder in society, or whether it has any effect. I guess definitely different people make different arguments about that, but the information or the data seems all over the place. And similarly with abortion, it's pretty hard to make a good argument about that. Certainly the kind of information we would need to have is about once you have a law banning abortion, what happens to the population in terms of numbers, what happens to the different people involved. So you need a study on the happiness of women, and there'll be different subpopulations. There'll be women who didn't want a child but ended up having one, and then women who didn't want a child and then ended up having an abortion. And we'd also need to have studies on the happiness of children who were given birth to by women who wanted an abortion but couldn't get one, to see if their lives are significantly worse than those of other children. So we need a good deal more information. Now, there's going to be all other things to take account of when it comes to looking at how abortion laws affect people's lives. And it's going to be different for different kinds of society. It'll make a difference whether the society is rich or poor, whether it's a gender equal society or whether it's patriarchal, and whether the society is supportive of poor single mothers. It's also going to make a difference whether it provides childcare for working women, and whether it punishes women who had illegal abortions, to what extent the society supports adoption. Right, so there's going to be all these different factors and other ones too. So if we were going to actually look at the utilitarian case for or against abortion and abortion laws, then we have to look at that data in order to get the information. And it's going to be pretty complicated, as it always is with a utilitarian approach. There's also a question about what the laws are going to be. Right? Some abortion laws are very strict and forbid basically all abortion. Other laws are fairly lax or open-ended, or they allow abortion in quite a lot of cases. So in a lot of countries, the limit for unrestricted abortion is like 10 weeks or 12 weeks. Then there can be other abortions allowed later on under more restricted circumstances. So it's going to make a big difference exactly what those abortion laws are. So that needs to be factored in when you're doing the studies. What kind of laws do you have? So certainly it's going to be very difficult to make predictions when it comes to utilitarianism. There's not a whole lot of information, and it's going to be very tricky to make these predictions. You have to be able to compare a society with the abortion law and without the abortion law, and you need to consider different options, and you choose the one which is going to make society as good, as happy as possible. But how do you do that? Do we have the information? I think generally we have very little information how that works. Generally we don't have a lot of understanding to what extent implementing a law has an effect on the happiness of society. There may be some which are pretty straightforward. It seems pretty clear that laws forbidding homosexual behavior probably create more pain than happiness. There may be a few homophobes who are made really happy by having the laws, and those people, maybe a lot of people would be made somewhat unhappy by allowing homosexual behavior to be legal. But the way that it impacts homosexual people, it's like, well, of course, they're going to be much happier if there are laws, if they are allowed to have the sex they want to have the relationships they want to have. So in those cases, I think we can make pretty clear predictions about the laws, and their effects. But when it comes to a lot of other laws, it's pretty hard to know exactly what the effects are going to be. And certainly, if you look at the utilitarian cases for the allowing abortion, it's not really very impressive. I mean, there is information available. So this is from a website saying for 2002 2022 what the abortion rates are. Well, I think obviously actually this information is from years past. You look at the slide, it's like 2003, 2002, 2001, but presumably things haven't changed a huge amount. And you'll see the countries with the lowest abortion rates have pretty low abortion rates. So this is the abortion rate per 1,000 women. And Mexico is lowest at the top. Then you get Portugal, Qatar, Austria, and so on. Notice that for most of these countries, abortion is in fact legal in them. So the reason that there is a low abortion rate is not that it's illegal, rather there are other factors, maybe cultural factors, whatever, but it's not necessarily the law that is creating a low abortion rate. The United States has an abortion rate of 20.8 women per 1,000 who have an abortion. So it's a good deal higher than the ones with the lowest abortion rates. If you look in the United States, then you'll see that it does seem that the states with the lowest abortion rates are also the ones which make abortion more difficult. So Wyoming has an abortion rate of about 1.3 per 1,000, and Utah is 4.4, Nebraska 5.5 per 1,000. Compare that with New York. New York has an abortion rate of 29.6, which is only outweighed by Washington, D.C., which has a rate of 32.7. Now, one thing we might ask is like, well, is it that the women are traveling from the states with low abortion rates and actually getting their abortions in places like New York and Washington, D.C.? Again, that's partly a question about how those statistics are collected. Is it talking about where will the women, does it count women in Wyoming who have had abortions in New York or not? So I guess there's an empirical question there about how the studies are done. But we might also think, what is it about those states? Is it also the culture? Is it the law? Those are the issues that we need to look at to see why do those states have low abortion rates. The morality of abortion for utilitarianism may be a little bit simpler if you're not looking at laws, but rather you're looking at individual people in particular situations and their decision whether or not to have an abortion. It might be easier for utilitarianism to make a prediction, to compare the two options and to say which one is going to lead to greater overall happiness. And obviously, a lot's going to depend, again, on whether your utilitarian theory wants to be measuring the total happiness of all the people involved, or rather it wants to be measuring the average happiness of all the people involved. And if it's looking at total, it's going to be much harder to justify the abortion. If it's looking at average, it's going to be much easier. So we should definitely bear that in mind. So utilitarianism may be more useful as a personal theory in some ways. Well, I'll have something to say about that in a second. Now, this might be a little controversial, I guess, but basically, the utilitarian calculation for abortion is going to be almost exactly the same as the utilitarian calculation for infanticide. So if it's possible that abortion would be morally permissible for utilitarianism, then it should also be morally permissible for infanticide. I mean, we might need to make some qualifications that for parents to be killing their young babies would be, maybe that would have an effect on society which abortion would not do, and so we need to take larger effects of infanticide on society. Maybe it would decrease the respect for life generally. So yeah, but I mean, as I've said before, it's pretty hard to know what those calculations are going to be saying anyway. But if you're a utilitarian and you do think that abortion can be defended, then at least you need to say something about infanticide, about whether or not you think that should can be defended too, and if not, then what is the difference? Now, I think it is worth pointing out that for modern society, we think infanticide is a terrible thing, and maybe one of the worst things you could possibly do. But that is not necessarily a universal value in history. It may well be that you're looking, say, at the ancient Romans, that it seems that they were pretty much okay with a lot of infanticide, and it was largely up to the family patriarch to decide whether a child should be kept and raised, or whether to send it out of the city and let it die from exposure. And it seems like infanticide was practiced throughout most of the ancient Roman times. And even when it was made illegal, it became a capital offense, it wasn't even prosecuted. So, definitely seems that the Romans didn't have a huge problem with infanticide. And they probably are not the only culture to think that infanticide was okay. So, if that's true for the Romans and it's true for other cultures, then utilitarians could say, well, look, we're just wrong in our intuitions about infanticide being so wrong, and we need to accept the results of the utilitarian calculation. That's certainly an option. It may be hard for us to get our heads around, but we need to have an argument in reply to the utilitarians. One kind of final point about utilitarianism is that it might be a good way to decide on what public policy is, although I've suggested it's pretty hard to actually make those calculations most of the time. But if you're running your own life, I don't think I've ever met anybody at any time who has run their lives exclusively on the question of what is going to maximize the total happiness for society. I mean, I think this is sort of psychologically impossible. and morally implausible. Um, it's very, this is a strange idea that you could spend your whole life working out how to maximize the total happiness of society and make all your decisions on that basis. And certainly, when we look at how women make decisions about abortions, they don't use utilitarian calculations. Now, the utilitarian could say, well, that's a shame because we have the right theory and so they should. But there is a question about, do you have a theory which is actually going to make any sense to people? And it's not, it doesn't make a lot of sense to a lot of people, to be honest. Let us now move on to the alternative theory that people have intrinsic worth and dignity, and that we should base our moral decisions on that intrinsic worth, and then think about how that relates to the abortion issue. So the basic issue, obviously, is that if a fetus has intrinsic worth, and it's the same as that of an adult human, then we can't kill the fetus, and we can't let it die. And so abortion would be wrong. And certainly that's, if you're looking at arguments against abortion, that tends to be the biggest one that's used in political discourse. And it may be appealing to some people. I want to kind of point out some issues with it. So when do most people think abortion is permitted? I'm talking about like when would most people agree, yeah, that abortion is definitely permitted? And the basic answer to that is in cases of rape and incest, where a woman gets pregnant, and also when the fetus will have physical or mental abnormalities. People think, well, yeah, then it's okay to get an abortion. So can we say that that actually is consistent with the idea that a fetus has worth intrinsically? Is that, and it seems like there's going to be a contradiction. A contradiction, yes. So in the United States, there have been some far-right politicians who say there should be no abortion whatsoever, that killing a fetus is always wrong, and it doesn't make any difference how a human comes into being. And it shouldn't make any difference what its disability or health status is. It still has the same rights. Now, those politicians tend to be in a minority, and they tend to be seen as being very extreme. So people tend to say, no, yeah, in the cases of rape and incest and abnormality, it's okay to have an abortion. But how can that fit with the idea that a fetus has intrinsic worth? It seems there's a problem there. All right. Now there's also the tricky question for the theory of intrinsic worth about when in the development of a fertilized egg does it get all this value? And there's various options, various theories we can consider, or stages. We could say it's at conception. We can say it's when the zygote attaches to the uterine wall, when the fetus gets a brain, when it gets a face, when it gets a heartbeat, or maybe it's as late as birth. Now, I guess we could talk about each of those in turn, but let me just say that none of them is particularly plausible. Right? It doesn't seem that at any stage that suddenly there's a big difference and that the fetus suddenly becomes valuable. Certainly, that's obvious at birth. The day before birth and the day after birth, the fetus is very much the same. Now, if you grant that, you might say, so yeah, it's very difficult for us to know. But clearly it does get the intrinsic value at some point. So you might go along with the conservatives and say, well, let's just suppose it's a conception because that's the safest option. So that might seem to be a plausible approach, although not one that people would always agree with. Now, I guess so. I want to get to the issues raised by Judith Jarvis Thompson, although I'm not going to address her article in any detail. I'm just going to look at some of the basic idea, which is what happens if the pregnancy is unwelcome. So let's just suppose that a fetus does have value, the same value as an adult human or a 5-year-old. And it's being carried by a pregnant woman. Can we say that because it wasn't invited, because the woman doesn't want it, she has the right to free herself of it? And those of you who have looked at Judith Jarvis Thompson's paper or some of the explanations of it regarding this will recall that it features a bizarre thought experiment about a violinist who is captured by some sort of fan club because the violinist has some particular condition, and the only way that the violinist can be kept alive is by being attached to a woman for 9 months. So they basically kidnap both of them and hook them up, and then the question is, can the woman walk away from the situation and let the violinist die? Now, I mean, that's such a bizarre thought experiment. The idea that we have any clear idea what we would think about that is a little bit of a stretch, I think. Now, a slightly easier sort of case to think about, maybe not such a good parallel, but I'm not exactly sure about the violinist case being a good parallel either, is what if somebody breaks into your house and says they're staying for 9 months? Do you have to let them stay? And what if, to add to this, we kind of make the thought experiment one, maybe it's you happen to be living in the middle of Mars. You're in Mars and you're in a sort of space station, and if you eject this person from your domicile, then they are going to die and you have to wait 9 months. So you didn't invite them in. Can you just kick them out? Well, I don't know if you have any clear intuitions about that. I'm not exactly sure what I would say. I mean, yeah, maybe. I don't have any very clear intuitions about that. So, you can make an argument, oh yeah, you'd have the right, but, who knows. And there's questions about, are these cases even similar to getting pregnant through rape or through accidents when the woman was using contraception? It seems that these seems quite different sorts of cases. So I think we need to be careful about using these parallels when talking about abortion. But it does raise an interesting question, at least. Does the fact that the woman has been using contraception and then got pregnant by accident, or indeed if she got pregnant through rape, does that make a big difference? Certainly for the rape case, many people will say, obviously it makes a big difference, but then the question is, why? Now, we talked about previously this idea that a fetus suddenly acquires full value, full human value. And that seems a problematic assumption. On the other hand, the alternative would be to say the value of the fetus gradually increases as it develops. So it starts off with basically almost zero value. Maybe the fertilized egg has some value, but not much. And then it gradually increases until it has full human value. And maybe that occurs around the time of birth. Possibly, some people would argue that it doesn't occur until the baby is 1 or 2 or 5 years old. But you're going to have different theories about that. It depends on what your theory of value is. Is it to do with the capacity to experience? Is it the capacity to have cognitive processes? Is it the capacity to have emotional processes? Those are all kind of possible candidates. None of them is immediately kind of obvious, and different people have argued for different ones. Certainly the idea that the fetus gradually increases in value seems to fit with a lot of our current practices, which say that early abortion may be permitted, but many people are far less likely to accept late abortion. Now, there is another argument, I guess, somewhat associated with the philosopher Don Marquis, although I wouldn't pretend that the idea I'm going to argue or talk about is exactly the same as the one that Marquis discusses, but basically the idea is that it's about future value, and that we should be against abortion because the fetus doesn't have value now, but it's going to have value. So how do we understand that? What sense can we make of that? Why should we treat a fetus as having deserving of respect just because it will deserve respect later on? Again, I think it's a pretty weird argument, and it's hard to know whether to take it seriously or what reason there is to take it seriously. Now, some people do accept the basic idea that the fetus it's going to have value later on, so we should treat it as valuable now. It seems like sort of self-contradictory, but some people say, well, we do that with some other cases, so we should do it in the case of fetuses. I guess fairly obviously I am not convinced about that one. A little earlier, I talked about how utilitarianism seems like a theory which, whatever its merits, is not actually used by women when they are deciding whether or not to have an abortion. And maybe that's true for other theories too. I think it's certainly an important and interesting question. How do women actually come to decide to have abortions or decide against having abortions? What's the reasoning process? Now, obviously, it's going to be different for different people. It's not as if everybody thinks the same. But at least we can look at different sorts of reasons that women have for having abortions. So let's take a look. So this table is from a study which looks at reasons which were given in surveys from 2004 and 1987. And so it's comparing the differences. You'll see the differences aren't actually that great. There's fairly minor differences. And we can see the number one reason is that the woman is not ready to have another or have a child, or said the timing is wrong. Then fairly close to that is the financial worries about whether they can afford a baby. And then third, but not too far away, is people who have completed their childbearing, or they have other people depending on them, or their children are grown. Right. So those are the top three, and those are by far kind of the are more common than all the other ones. So this it's interesting to see that, you know, not wanting to be a single mother, or having relationship problems, or not being mature enough, or interfering with education or career, or health problems, or worries about the health of the fetus. I mean, they're all fairly significant, but by no means are they as common as the other sorts of reasons. And then there's other cases like which are very rare, in fact, being a victim of rape, the partner wanting the woman to have an abortion, parents wanting the woman to have an abortion, or the woman not wanting to know that, not wanting other people to know that she had sex or she got pregnant. So I think it's useful to be aware of the actual sorts of reasons that women give for having abortions. All right, let's move on to virtue ethics. And I'll assume that you pretty much know what virtue ethics is. I'm not going to explain it, but we're going to talk about how it relates to abortion. And I guess it's a little surprising in some ways. Or what, you know, this question like, well, how could it relate? You know, we think, well, Aristotle was the creator of virtue ethics, and there wasn't a whole lot of abortion back then. Now, I guess that in fact, regarding what I was saying about the Roman Empire was probably also true about the Roman times. Was also true of Greek times. So they had infanticide back in Roman times and also in Greek times. So Aristotle was certainly familiar with infanticide, but you know, if you read through his work, certainly he doesn't make a big deal about it. Doesn't seem to think it's particularly worthy of comment. So it doesn't seem like he would actually be too concerned about abortion. But obviously, we live in different times from Aristotle, so maybe looking at virtue ethics from a different point of view would lead us to different results. And I guess there is this further complication that virtue ethics and natural law were particularly adopted by the Catholic Church later on in early Christian times, and the Catholic Church was certainly against any interruptions of what they call natural sex, sexual processes, and it's certainly these days the Catholic Church is against abortion. It seems these days it might seem that a virtue ethicist would be more likely to be against abortion. So we're going to look at the work of Rosalind Hursthouse. It's a lovely picture of her, which I copied from Wikipedia. And so she was born in 1943. She was born in Britain, but she moved to the University of Auckland, although she did, I think she kind of spent her childhood in New Zealand, and then she went back to the UK, and then she went back to New Zealand. But certainly, you know, she is a notable figure. She's long defended virtue ethics. Her paper on abortion and virtue ethics has been reprinted in all sorts of collections. It's also worth noting that she was mentored by two other very well-known women philosophers, Elizabeth Anscombe and Philippa Foot. All right, so basically, Hursthouse wants to say that virtue ethics is a better process or a better theory to use than rights theory. She doesn't even mention utilitarianism. She's all about saying why virtue ethics is better than using rights, and she wants to say that using rights is not really very helpful, and it doesn't really pay attention to human relationships. She wants to say that certainly that having an abortion is a morally difficult and significant decision. And one piece of evidence she wants to give for that is that when somebody has a miscarriage, we see that as a bad thing for the person. We don't dismiss it and say, oh, just stop worrying about it. It was just a bunch of cells. And so similarly for abortion, she says that we should take it seriously. It's like, again, it's not just a bunch of cells that are being got rid of. Earlier I used the parallel between a tumor and abortion, and certainly we think there's a big difference between having an abortion and getting rid of a tumor. So Hursthouse wants to say that it may be wrong to get an abortion. She certainly kind of comes down on the side of saying, well, sometimes it's wrong. So she's not really contesting whether or not whether women have a right to it. She's sort of assuming that women do have a right to an abortion. But she says, well, that doesn't really exhaust the argument. So that's the kind of view she's leading towards. Now, definitely Hursthouse is not a relativist, but she does say that what is virtuous can change depending on what kind of society you're living in. And if you're living in a society where pregnancy is very hard, then people might see abortion as a blessing. But she wants to say in that kind of society where pregnancy is very hard and abortion is a better result, that is a sort of, she says, in a very mild way, something is amiss. We might use stronger language, and something is pretty messed up about that society if pregnancy is that hard. So in a society where life is very hard, certainly virtues are going to be very different, and but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't say what virtues are. And basically, Hursthouse's approach is that in our society where life is reasonably easy, then we want to say that having a child is a good thing. Being a parent, being a mother, and childbirth are what she calls intrinsic goods. So if you reject intrinsic goods, then it may well be that you are a shallow and callous person. I am sort of struck by the parallels between saying that motherhood is an intrinsic good and some of the approaches in natural law, which give lists of intrinsic goods, and you sort of wonder, well, how do they come up with that list? One of the very common ones is that life is an intrinsic good. So you wonder, well, how do you know life is intrinsically good? What makes it intrinsically good? Do you have an account of it being intrinsically good, or is it just obvious? Because it's not necessarily obvious to everyone. And we might say that with motherhood, like, well, why is motherhood an intrinsic good? What is it about motherhood which makes it intrinsically good? And well, where did you get that from? I think those issues need to be raised when it comes to discussing Hearst House. Hearst House's kind of central idea then is that if you're going to have an abortion, you have to appreciate the good of motherhood. So if you have good reasons to reject motherhood, then things are fine. But if you're basically doing it trivially, then you're doing it without proper moral consideration and without thinking about it, then you are doing something wrong. There's something wrong with your character. So she definitely wants to say that abortion can be morally permissible. A virtuous person can have abortions. She gives an example of a woman with several children who fears that having a baby will make it difficult for her to be a good mother to her existing children. Then it seems like, well, she appreciates the good of motherhood, but there are other things they could take in consideration. She also says, well, what if you've had a few kids and you want to be a grandmother, but if you have a baby, then you won't be a good grandmother. If you have a child with a child, basically you'll be too busy to be contributing to the care of that grandchild. And she also says, it's possible to be a woman who rejects motherhood altogether because she has other things to do. But the other things to do have to be morally significant. They have to be something which are worth doing, which are part of a virtuous life. There are plenty of ways to proceed to live your life, and they can include having an abortion. What she seems to be especially rejecting are what she thinks of as frivolous choices, where you just decide to have an abortion because you want to have fun, you want to have a good time, and you don't care about living a good life, you don't care about motherhood, you just want to kind of play on your Xbox. So she says, well, that's not a good reason for having an abortion, and she thinks that somebody who does that is kind of just a shallow person. Now she also talks about women who aren't ready for motherhood, and she says, well, maybe that's a good reason. On the other hand, life is difficult, and basically you're never ready for motherhood. So assuming there's some perfect time to have a baby is a mistake. So then she says, no, you can't be a perfectionist, and so if you're having an abortion because you're waiting for the right time, you should at least be aware that maybe your standards of having of when to have a baby are mistaken. And she says, basically a virtuous woman, and this probably applies to any person, not just a woman, has character traits such as strength, independence, resoluteness, decisiveness, self-confidence, responsibility, serious-mindedness, and self-determination. And if you don't have all that, then your life is going to be harder. Although I think fairly obviously all of us have those traits only to some degree. None of us is perfect. And Hearst House obviously understands that. She's saying we shouldn't expect to be kind of completely virtuous and completely able to negotiate life with no problem. So Hearst House kind of winds up. She's saying, both men and women need to be morally serious, and you can't dismiss parenthood. You can choose not to be a parent, but then you need to be very careful. You need to be, especially if you're going to have sex, then you need to be careful about how you do that, and I guess obviously, she's basically saying you need to use contraception. But also, I guess maybe you shouldn't be having sex at all if you don't want to risk becoming a parent, if you don't have a good reason not to be a parent. So she thinks that abortions can be chosen for good reasons, and they can be chosen for bad reasons. And the bad reasons will reflect a kind of callous, greedy, or foolish attitude to life. So, she definitely is, a little on the judgy side there, but maybe she's right. Now, what would we want to say to Hearst House? I guess there's responses from two different sides. There are sort of conservatives who say, look, you've conceded far too much by saying that there could be a right to an abortion. People want to say, look, a fetus has full value and therefore it's always wrong to interfere with its life, and abortion is terrible, or it's wrong to stop life from coming to exist. So some conservatives saying she gives far too much away. Um, on the other hand, um, you know, some women, some feminists may say that she's being far too judgy, and a woman should be able to decide for herself. And just if a woman doesn't want to, become a brain surgeon, and she also doesn't want to become a mother, and she just wants to kind of lead a simple life, who are you to be all judgy about it? So it's interesting to think about like what a feminist response to Hearst House would be. I think it's useful to think back to the reasons that women have abortions. And it seems, I mean, there is the sort of gray area of not being ready to be a mother, and maybe Hearst House is going to be a bit judgy about that. But on the whole, it seems that Hearst House would actually be kind of fine with most of the reasons that women generally give for wanting to have an abortion. So in fact, it seems that feminists on the whole would probably be pretty comfortable with a lot of what Hearst House is saying, because women generally don't have frivolous reasons for wanting to have an abortion. There aren't women who are saying, I want to play on my Xbox so instead of having a kid. So on the whole, I would say that Hearst House is going to be more accepted by on the feminist side than on the conservative side. Let's finish up talking about feminist approaches. Now, there's all sorts of feminist approaches. I'm not going to talk about all of them. There's radical feminism, socialist feminism, liberal feminism, separatist feminism, and so on. So there's feminist theories are multiple, and kind of gradually, there's certainly hard to summarize or put all into one box. But I just want to kind of address a couple of different approaches which are at least relevant for my purposes in this slideshow. So I think there's a lot of power in the phrase "my body, my choice." The idea is appealing. I think it's a powerful slogan. So we might think it's simply about bodily autonomy, that people can do what they want with their own bodies, which is a sort of basic theory that derives from the idea of intrinsic dignity, that people have a right to lead their own lives as they want. And generally people will say autonomy is a very valuable thing in life. Although the natural law theorists don't often list autonomy as one of the basic goods, I think, if anybody else was driven to say what are the basic goods, they would say autonomy is pretty important. Although obviously the utilitarians are going to cash it out in terms of it making people and society happier. Anyway, so it might seem that my body, my choice is about bodily autonomy, but I think it's not just about that. Because if a fetus does actually have full human value, then we have to respect that value, and it seems that there's a harm principle involved, and you shouldn't be harming other creatures of value. So if pregnancy didn't last 9 months, but if the child was attached to a woman for 2 years, and still had the same developmental stages, it would be pretty hard to say my body, my choice when the 2-year-old was still attached, and if the woman just said, like, I'm gonna end this baby's or this infant's life because it's my body, that wouldn't be very plausible. I think people would find that a lot trickier. So again, I'm not sure about that example, but the basic point I want to make is that my body, my choice is more about the idea that it's a woman's choice what moral view to take. She's not compelled to take any particular moral view, partly because philosophy hasn't proven the truth of any particular any particular moral view. So it's a personal decision what moral view to take. And if a woman thinks that abortion is wrong, then she will not have an abortion. But if she thinks it's permissible and she thinks that it's the right thing for her, then it's for her to make that decision. So in some ways, it's not just my body, my choice, but it's also my mind, my choice, my life, my choice. So it seems that is a kind of basic principle that that informs the feminist approach to whether or not abortion is morally permissible or even morally right. I want to finish up just briefly talking about the ethics of care. Again, I guess what I may say is a little bit controversial, but I think it's worth at least putting it out there. There are people who defend the ethics of care rarely say that care is the only value, and they generally say that you need to have an ethics of justice and an ethics of care, and you have some combination, some balance, some integration of the two of them. So it may well be that you can give considerations from justice, such as from autonomy, what we were just talking about, that would give a reason for the permissibility or impermissibility of abortion. So then care wouldn't really come into it because justice would deal with all of it. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but if you believe in the ethics of care, then it also seems that you think that the role of justice is going to be not primary all the time. So I mean, we can think about Rosalind Hursthouse when she talked about virtue ethics, saying that the issues of rights don't settle everything. So in the ethics of care, we could say that the rights don't settle everything. So if we're thinking about the ethics of care, how does care apply to pregnancy? Well, if a woman is happy about being pregnant, and maybe even if she isn't, but certainly if she is, then generally she will take a lot of steps to care for her fetus. And in fact, generally, uh, it's pretty rare for a woman to refer to her fetus. Generally, she will refer to her baby. And the word baby almost automatically implies a caring relationship. Women will have their first baby pictures these days, which come from their first sonograms. So, and if you think of the kind of the narrative of the baby's life with the first pictures, then the idea is that this caring relationship starts pretty early on during pregnancy. So it seems that um, for women there is going to be a lot of caring for their fetus. And if that's true, then there's a question: well, what's the ethics of care? What's the caring part going to say about abortion? Because it's not so clear how having an abortion demonstrates a caring attitude. And if caring is what's especially important, having a caring relationship, being in that relationship, then having an abortion doesn't seem very compatible with that. Um, Now, certainly the ethics of care does say caring is very important, and unless you are living alone in the middle of nowhere, then you are going to be having caring relationships with other people. Well, I guess you could be uh, just buying stuff from other people and not having relationships with them, but presumably most of us are going to be in relationships with people we like, and humans are social animals, and we need to have caring relationships. That's basically part of human nature. So everyone has people close to them, and so one of the points that the ethics of care makes is that people need to nurture their relationships. That's an essential part of life, of kind of looking after our relationships. And tends to be that there's often a stereotype that women are the carers and men are not caring. And I guess one point to make is obviously that men can be caring. But it may also be that women don't want to always end up in caring relationships, and they can reject being in a caring relationship. And that's partly their choice. And certainly it's going to be impossible to care for everyone. You can't care for everyone equally. So living life, you have to decide which relationships you're going to be in and which you're not going to be in. So if a woman discovers she's pregnant, she may decide she doesn't want to be pregnant, and she may decide that she's not going to take on the identity of being a carer. She's not going to have that as a caring relationship. And so it seems that at least in one way to kind of develop the ethics of care is to say that women have the right to decide which caring relationships they want to be in. And a woman may decide that no, she doesn't want to be a mother, or at least not at that stage. And so it's fine to reject that relationship. Doesn't mean that caring is not part of life, but it's not part of that particular relationship, and therefore a woman can decide to have an abortion. I think there's going to be more to say about that, and maybe we would want to talk about the possible kind of grief that can also occur around abortion. It's not simply, oh, I'm rejecting that relationship, because sometimes it's not as simple as that. People aren't able just to kind of totally control their emotions, but so it can be a more complicated story than that. But that's the kind of basic suggestion I would want to make, that how the ethics of care might approach the issue of abortion. That's it for now.